Hello everybody. Thank you for joining our Electoral Reform Society webinar at this time. My name is Darren Hughes. I'm the Chief Executive of the ERS, and I'm delighted to be joined by my colleague Thea Ridley-Castle, who's been the author of this great new report that came out in March 2024, earlier this year, Pursuing Parity, an examination of gender quotas across electoral systems. If you're joining us live, you'll know that in the last hour, it's been quite a momentous part of the British political calendar because the Prime Minister has announced there'll be a general election on Thursday, the 4th of July, across all four nations of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. So we're all off to the races, off to election day. And just in the last few minutes, the Leader of the Opposition has responded to that. So quite a lot of active politics happening right now. And if maybe down the track you're watching a recording of this discussion, you'll know better than we do what happened on the 4th of July. In the meantime, we're going to get on with talking about this fantastic new report that we've put out at the Electoral Reform Society. And just before we get started on that, I should say we're really welcoming questions from participants, and you'll see in the Q&A box an ability to put some questions in, and just do that at any time you like. There's no need to wait for a particular moment. Our colleague Lizzie is monitoring the questions, and she'll let us know what they are. So that's a way of you being able to participate by putting in a question, and we will read it out and then have a discussion about your question that has come in. Obviously, you're already aware of the work of the ERS if you're on this call and attending this webinar. But I hope that if you like the work that you see and believe in the cause that we're trying to push for, then you'll become either more active in the ERS by going from being a supporter to a member, or you'll recruit some of your friends and family to become supporters for us. So we'll be hoping to grow this movement, and we'll also be trying very hard to make sure that proportional representation, electoral reform, democratic inclusion form a big part of this general election coming up, because it's been a very tough few years for institutions and public trust in institutions, and we need to make sure that we get the kind of change that I think many people believe is well overdue. At the Electoral Reform Society, we were founded in 1884, so we're very much focused on trying to achieve a better democracy, and that's what we really do campaign and research and advocate for. And in the last few years, we've really tried to bring an emphasis to the issue of gender representation and the big disparity that we have at the House of Commons in particular, but also other institutions like the House of Lords. That's a discussion for another day. And we've been involved in organisations, or a collection of organisations like Counting Women in last decade, and we've been really pleased to be active participants of the Centennial Action Group as well. That's been looking at issues around political parties' responsibilities and duties under the Equalities Act, and really delighted that Helen Pankhurst was able to write the foreword to the report that Thea has written, and then we'll be discussing today, right now. So Thea, over to you. Thank you for producing this great piece of research and work, and I think we're all looking forward to hearing what your findings are, and then opening up for a discussion around questions to take the conversation forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Darren, for that introduction. I will just share my screen so that we can get started. I think, is that okay? Cool. I'm getting the thumbs up from our colleague Lizzie, so we're all good. So first of all, thank you for coming to this webinar on my recent report, Pursuing Parity, examining gender quotas across electoral systems. I'm thrilled to see so many of you interested in this topic and wanting to learn more about how gender quotas can interact with electoral systems to create a more representative parliament. I'm going to talk through some of the report now. There is a lot of information in there, so if there's anything that you're particularly interested in, please do. I'm sure we'll share the link to it, and you can read further into it at some point. So we're going to be talking about different quota types, how they interact with different electoral systems, and finishing up with a case study on France. But before I do that, I think it's really important to set the current scene of women in Parliament at the moment. So here's my next slide. So globally, only 7 parliaments as of April 2024 have gender parity in their lower or single house, and that feels staggering considering how many countries we have. Women only make up 35% of the House of Commons here, which again seems staggering considering the amount of women we have. And the progress, I mean, it's steady, it is increasing. So in 1995, women made up only 11.3% of parliamentarians. By 2022, we've doubled that at least and made it to 26.5%. But I mean, that growth is incredibly slow. And actually in 2022, it was the slowest progression of women's representation in parliaments in 6 years. So it only increased by 0.4%. So there's a lot more that needs to be done. And at that current rate, the European Institute of Gender Equality estimates that it will take 80 years for gender parity to happen in elected bodies worldwide. So today we're going to kind of set out two ways that we can help push that, bring that date further forward. So we're going to talk about how gender quotas can interact with different electoral systems. I'm going to start with some stats on 2022. So in 2023, the Interparliamentary Union released data on elections held in 2022. So across all the countries that had held elections in 2022, those which had a plurality or majoritarian voting system, similar to the one that we have at Westminster, elected only 22% women. And those under proportional or mixed voting systems elected 29% women. This is a consistent trend, and we can see from this that PR systems elect more women than others do. In the same report, the IPU also analysed the percentage of women elected in 2022 in countries with gender quotas and those without. And those without legislated gender quotas only elected 22% women, and those with legislated quotas elected 30% women. So we can see that quotas can impact the number of women being elected as well as the electoral system mechanism in place. There are multiple types of quotas, and we are going to talk about them now, and some of which work better in different electoral systems than others. And we'll go on to how they actually interact with the electoral system in a minute, but I think it's important that we kind of key down into the three main types of electoral gender quotas, just so we all are on the same page. So we've got reserved seats, non-legislative party quotas, and legislative quotas. So with reserved seats, they're seats set aside for women, which men are unable to contest. Reserved seats are not only used for women. In many cases, they've been employed around the world to guarantee a political voice for marginalised communities. And obviously, what constitutes a marginalised community depends on the political context and the specific country context. And reserving seats guarantees political representation of women in Parliament. So there's three versions. You've got a women-only national tier, so only women can stand in that national tier. You've got constituencies which are reserved for women, so certain constituencies only women can run in, and the best loser system. And the best loser system is where they look at the amount of votes that women candidates got that didn't win in their seat, and the highest percentage, the ones that had the highest percentage of vote get allocated a certain number of seats in the Parliament. And then we've got non-legislative quotas, and these are voluntary pledges by parties to include a specific percentage of women. So political parties will mandate a quota on their candidate selection. There's no standardised mechanism for implementing quotas across the parties, which could lead to inequitable access to quotas across the political system. And again, these are at the party's discretion. So, you know, where they stand women doesn't have to be in a safe or competitive seat. It could be one that they have no indication that they have any chance of winning. So it can be a bit of a nod to it rather than a proper impactful measure that a party puts in place. And then finally, you've got legislative quotas, which are laws in place which require a certain percentage of women to be nominated by a political party. These can have enforcement mechanisms, so you could invalidate a list if it did not meet the percentage that was given by the law, or you could be fined, those type of things. A legislative quota means that all political parties must adhere to the same rules and stipulations, and that kind of removes the ad hoc implementation of party quotas that can be seen under non-legislative party quotas. So talking about, we've already looked at how many women were elected in 2022, but there's a really interesting graph done by the European Institute for Gender Equality, also research done by them, which shows, I hope that's not too blurry, I'm looking at that now, shows that legislative quotas are the most effective for increasing gender parity. So this graph here, the pink line is legislative candidate quotas and the blue line is no action. And it shows a side-by-side comparison since 2004 of countries with legislative candidate quotas and with no action at all. So you can see that with countries with legislated quotas on the pink line here, I'm not sure if you can see my mouse, that they have actually doubled their percentage of women between 2004 and 2021. So they've gone from 17.3% here to 34.9%. Here, that's an increase of 17.6 percentage points. And countries with no action started at a higher base of 23.2, but they've actually finished slightly lower on 31.6 and have only increased their percentage pointage by 8.4%. And the IEG predicts that countries with gender quotas will achieve gender balance by legislative gender quotas, by 2026, so in 2 years' time. However, those without will not achieve gender balance until 2038. So those types of gender quotas that I've just talked about can be implemented across different electoral systems. So I'm going to go on now to talk a little bit about how they're implemented and what that means. So the system that we have for Westminster is a majoritarian system. So this impacts what we would see if we weren't to move to proportional representation. So they're characterised by a single member district where voters elect one person to represent them per district. And there are various versions of quotas which can be implemented, like there on the right, nomination quotas, super districts, rotating districts, and alternative thresholds. However, I'm going to talk about nomination quotas in this session, as they're the simplest to create under a plurality or majoritarian system, as it wouldn't need a structural change to the voting system and that the other quota options would. We do go into that a little bit more in the report if you're interested in that. So a nomination quota, if it was not legislated for, would rely on party cooperation and buy-in if these quotas were not. They also would not be incentivized if they were not legislated for. So there would be no sanctions for non-compliance. Academics have said that legislative quotas and candidate nomination quotas might not be the best fit for the type of system that we are in, as with a low district magnitude, individuals rather than parties are competing for the votes, and parties are less likely to risk nominating a female candidate to run against a male candidate. Again, in the UK, there has been little appetite from both of the main parties and from the public to have gender quotas, but there has been success of using all women shortlists by the Labour Party, which were introduced in 2010, which we would characterise as a voluntary party quota, and they've had the greatest impact on gender parity in Parliament. And just to sum all of this up, that majoritarian and plurality systems, from the analysis of 2022, they're the least likely to elect women. And women made up only 19.5% of those elected in 2022. And if elected, if there is no legislative necessity in place to mandate this, there's no guarantee that women's representation will continue to increase with voluntary party quotas unless the quotas are legislated for or enforced with a punitive measure, which means that they could backslide very easily. In contrast, a proportional system it's considered to be one of the most favourable for women's representation in Parliament, and that's because of its electoral elements, the district and party magnitudes, the formula used to allocate seats, and the ballot structure. And academics have said that they're more responsive to increasing women's access to political participation. Three of these things, there's many, but three of the main ones are that the large number of parties in a PR system increase the probability that one party will actively promote women candidates and employ gender quotas. We saw that in Germany. The Green Party introduced gender quotas and the other parties followed suit. Numerous candidates are often fielded in a PR system, and therefore there's more opportunity for a diverse range of candidates to be fielded, and this allows for a more balanced candidate list to be created. And also the quotas which are created within the PR system are more adaptable to the country context. So for example, horizontal and vertical zipping are more intuitive to PR systems and are easier to specialise and adapt to the certain situation. I'm not going to go too much into horizontal and vertical zipping, but again, there's more information in the report. But a in essence, horizontal zipping would be that across all constituencies, the number of different genders standing should be equal or close to equal. So it can specify to each party the gender candidates at the top of the list, and that could alternate between constituencies, or they can decide between themselves as long as they present a balanced top of the list across all constituencies. Vertical zipping relates to just a candidate list. And the fundamental principle of this distribution is to have equal or close to equal women candidates or different gendered candidates on the party list. So a typical list would contain 50% women and 50% men. And vertical zipping would indicate that as you go down the list, no two adjacent candidates are of the same gender. And just to put this into context for you, we've got the example of France, and we can really see in France how the electoral system impacts the effectiveness of the quota. So in 2000, France adopted a 50-50 gender quota for oral elections, and the French National Assembly primarily uses single-member districts with a two-round voting system. And as of 2013, municipal elections use a PR system, a two-round party list system. So we're able to compare side by side the effectiveness of the quotas and the electoral systems. The only difference in the implementation of these quotas is in the National Assembly, there's a leeway of 2% for the National Assembly, and the compliance measures. So for the National Assembly, you have financial penalties for non-compliance, and in the Municipal Council, you have your list invalidated. So after the instigation of the quota, the percentage of the women in the National Assembly increased from 10.9% in 1997 to 12.3% in 2002, and then to 18.5% in 2007. So in that 10-year period, they've only moved around 8 percentage points. So that's not a massive increase. And research by Murray showed that this minimal impact was actually due to the placement of women in unwinnable seats. In contrast, in municipal elections, quotas in combination with stronger sanctions, and by stronger sanctions, I mean actual list invalidation rather than just a fine, it's quoted as being resulted in a historic leap in women's representation. So they moved from 25.7% to 47.5% in their first election afterwards in 2001, and then to 48.5%. So they've nearly doubled the representation of women in the municipal elections there. So this example shows how a PR system with gender quotas and a strong disciplinary measure, such as invalidating lists rather than fines, which parties can kind of like subsume into their costs if they wanted to, as their running costs, has proven more successful in increasing gender parity than in a single member district majoritarian system with minimal measures for non-compliance. Supporting these findings from France is our analysis of countries who had parliamentary renewal, so a new parliament in 2022, depending on electoral system and gender quota. So the graph shows the average percentage of women elected in 2022 by electoral system and gender quota. So here at the bottom, you've got the electoral system, so plurality and majority, which is our Westminster style, and proportional representation here. Purple is no quotas, and pink is quotas, including voluntary or legislative. So we find that countries with proportional voting systems and gender quotas elected the highest percentage of women in 2022, which was 30.5%. And countries with gender quotas elect more women than those without across electoral systems. So you've got here 28.2% with quotas and 30.5% versus these two here. Finally, moving on to our findings. For gender parity to be achieved in elected bodies, both the electoral system and the mechanism for increasing women's participation need to be aligned. The most effective method around the world used is legislative quotas with sanctions applied when these are not met, alongside a PR system, proportional representation, which allows quotas to be implemented and women to stand in multi-member constituencies with relative ease in comparison to under a majoritarian or plurality system. You'll have to forgive me fumbling my words. There's a lot of big ones in this presentation. So gender quotas are a useful and effective mechanism for increasing gender parity in elected bodies. And in 2022, chambers with quotas increased the growth rate of women's representation by almost 3% from the previous year. So if you remember back to the start of the presentation, overall, we only increased in 2022 by 0.4%. So they've got 2.5% above the average, which is pretty good. And legislated quotas with sanctions for non-compliance are the most effective quota mechanism, as they're compulsory, they create accountability, and they're durable against party forces. A PR system is more conducive to implementing legislative quotas due to the likelihood of it having multi-member districts, which allow for more candidates and diverse candidates to be fielded. It increases the political space for smaller parties to push for adoption, like I mentioned, the Green Party in Germany. And there's the ability to create flexible and adaptable quota mechanisms to fit a specific country context. And quite aptly, we've actually done a new bit of research of gender mapping of the next parliament, which will be happening way sooner than I think any of us thought would be happening. So this demonstrates the UK's reliance we have on parties doing the right thing and standing women candidates. So we've done some analysis based on the most recent YouGov MRP polling, which shows that Labour would hold 403 seats, Conservatives 155, Lib Dems 49, SNP 19, Plaid 4, and Green 1 in the next election. So these are the total selected as of yesterday, or to know today, 22nd is today. And we've used this data and mapped the gender of the candidates from our friends at the Democracy Club for winning seats. And we find that 42.4% down here of the MPs, or 253, will be women if the YouGov MRP results are replicated in the next general election. And of the candidates selected and predicted to win, Labour have the most women MPs by party. So they've got 178, which would be 47.3% of the Parliamentary Labour Party. Going down the list, 46 would be women for Conservative MPs, which is 31.5%, and 20 would be for Lib Dem MPs, which is 40.8% of those elected in those parties. So we can see from this that whilst the number of women is increasing, and if we got to 42.4% from the current 35%, that would be a 7 percentage point difference, which would be amazing. And by the European Institute of Gender Equality estimations, they put gender parity being at 40% women, so we would have reached that, which would be great. However, you can see that we're relying on a really large Labour majority in order for this to happen. So our argument from this is that we need gender quotas to ensure that with the next churn of Parliament, that we're not relying on one party to stand all women or majority women, and we should be standing women. All should be standing women, and we don't want to see any backsliding in the next Parliament. So this is why we're advocating for gender quotas in the next Parliament. And I'm going to hand back to Darren now, but I'm very happy to take any questions afterwards, hearing your thoughts on the piece of research. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Thea, and for going through such a thorough report so comprehensively. I think people who are joining the webinar will see why you're the Research and Policy Officer for the Electoral Reform Society with such a great detailed knowledge, but also the way you put it, I think makes the case just so clearly. And I think the thing that stood out for me is that sometimes people will argue that just do nothing, things will sort themselves out. But the report really makes it clear that means 80 years for that to be realised globally, which I just think makes this an urgent matter. And I also think that you're tying it together with electoral systems brings in our ERS work as well. There was a part of the report which I thought is worth just really emphasising for people, so that link is made clear, that it says that the link between PR systems and women's representation is well established. And I just wondered if you wanted to say a little bit more on some of the findings there, because you've just given us that last, most recent analysis about a first past the post improvement.
Yeah, of course. And, you know, the Interparliamentary Union has been putting out research on this for a while now. And their review found that like countries with proportional representation or mixed electoral systems elect more women, and it's consistently found this. And they also emphasize that it's one of the most significant factors in increasing the levels of women's representation. I'm sure that combines with lots of other factors, but yeah, PR systems are the one that mean that with the multi-member districts, with the diversity of candidates being able to be on the list, more women are elected and more diverse candidates are elected.
Which I think that ties in so nicely with trying to improve democracy, because we can translate voters' preferences into actual representation in a way that first past the post just can't do. I mean, as we know from the 2019 election, 70% of the votes didn't impact on the outcome because they were either cast for candidates that lost or candidates that won and no longer required those votes under a first past the post system. So we'd be translating people's actual levels of support into parliamentary seats, which would be a novel idea, every vote counting, but also that next step, which is how do you ensure the quality of representation by bringing in, making sure that there is diversity and effective representation. So it's really great to be able to dive deep into these examples that you've given. I wonder, we might take a couple of examples of other locations just to share some of your findings there. I was struck with Ireland, which of course uses the single transferable vote, and they've taken some measures to not only make an improvement, but they've developed that a bit further, haven't they? And they've also put in some pretty effective non-compliance measurements, which sounds to me as though this is a pretty important part of a regime that you can't just say, please do this and hope that it will all happen.
Yeah, so the findings of the report and the evidence shows that legislative quotas, they're brilliant and they do work, but they're not as strong if you don't actually sanction or put a punitive measure onto a party for not complying with it. So in Ireland, if they don't comply with the quota, which is 40% men, 40% women, then they lose 50% of their state funding. And the research shows that those with the mechanisms of having some kind of punitive measure means that more parties adhere to them. So in 2020, there were 23 TDs in the Irish Parliament, and half of that was women. And in the first election, when gender quotas were applied, it jumped to the highest number and proportion of women candidates in any election in the Republic of Ireland. And actually, there was further analysis done by Buckley, which showed that, like, actually in this election, there were 551 candidates that contested the election, and 163 of them were women, and that was a 90% increase in the number of women who stood as candidate from the previous election in 2011. So not only is kind of like a PR system electing more women, it's also fostering the environment more women want to run.
Making it a more encouraging place, and people see more people like them, and then they're more likely to stand. And certainly in New Zealand, that's been the experience under 10 general elections under proportional representation. I wonder, thinking more on the British Isles, with what's been happening in Wales, there's some significant changes to the Senate in Cardiff Bay, with devolution now 25 years old and taking its next sort of steps along the democratic journey of Wales. And I know there was an expert panel on assembly reform. Do you want to say something about how they've tried to examine and look at this issue?
Yeah, and I think it's important to say that in Wales, it was the first country worldwide to actually achieve gender parity. I think that was in 2003. It had 30 men and 30 women in MSs, but actually those quota, though, that because there wasn't any legislated quotas, that's actually backslid since then, and they've not actually reached that mark since then. So that's another reason for legislation, that we can have these amazing gender parity parliaments, but they only last as long as the parties themselves are putting those in place. And I think it's time to move beyond that. And in terms of what Wales are doing, they've currently decided that they're going to go with a closed list electoral system. And they're also looking at introducing vertical and horizontal quotas, 50% men, 50% women in their systems. So that would mean that every constituency in Wales, across all of them, 50% would have to be women and 50% men at the tops of the lists. And then further down the list in the closed system, that zipping, the vertical zipping, there would have to be men, woman, man, woman, man, woman underneath that. Which research has shown, like I presented, that would make a massive difference on the electoral system. And that was the same that the panel that you mentioned, the commission, found as well, that it would really impact the gender diversity of the representation in the Senate.
That's right, because you're trying to move into some long-term structural change to improve things rather than just relying on a particular election outcome. And
Yeah, and I think it's
I couldn't.
important to, oh, sorry.
No,
I was just going to say, I think it's important to note as well that in Wales, this isn't just a bill about gender quotas. It's a whole structural change that they're doing in Wales, a whole raft of changes. And I think that's why the PR element along with gender quotas links so well, because it's part of an entire electoral reform movement rather than just kind of like patching the cracks as and when they come up and as and when we see them. And I think that's really important to see it as like holistically as a whole reform approach rather than kind of like pulling in bits that we like at different points.
That's such an important point, because there's so many challenges out there now, and unless people are looking at it as a whole thing for citizens in their totality, then you end up just either something that's the flavour of the month and then reversed by someone else, and you get into that sort of ping pong politics, which we've just put up with for far too long. So it's really great how that's come together. And in fact, the zipping section of the report goes quite thoroughly into what you've just been describing with the horizontal and vertical. So very much encourage people to look at that. And another thing I wanted to ask you, and then we've got some questions that have come in from people who are watching, and the Q&A box is on the Zoom screen there. But it's just kind of builds on what you were saying. We're in this time where it just feels like there's such a lack of confidence or trust or faith in some of our institutions, and just what impact you think that a far greater commitment to gender balance would have on things like parliaments and cabinets and these institutions that when faith is lost in it can be so hard to rebuild.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to say what impact actually having women there would have on policy outcomes because there's so many contributing factors. But what we can say is that having more women in parliaments and more women around the table and in these discussions is that you're having a larger variety of views, and there's more lived experience feeding into the policy creation, which is better for policy. It makes it more well-rounded and it brings in so many more views. Again, not having to patch policy. We've got kind of policy that's built from like a wide variety of views. So, that's really important for not having to go back and change, like having a solid piece that can kind of withstand the times. But we also know that, like, from recent evidence from academic in Royal Holloway now, Jennifer Piscopo, who helped with the report as well. Her and her colleagues have been looking at kind of like legitimacy and gender parity. And they found that political institutions, when there is gender parity in the political institution, decision-making processes and their decisions are viewed as more legitimate. So it benefits parliaments to have gender balance as it's viewed as more legitimacy. And in a time of kind of complete distrust, having women's voices and a gender balanced parliament, I can think that can only do good things in terms of making people believe in what is happening and the policies that are made. And these findings held true even when the issue is gendered. So a gender balanced panel, even elected using quotas, are still substantially preferred to an all-male decision-making group. So that holds for the decision itself and the process of decision making. So you see that when women are involved in the conversation, public trust and concepts of legitimacy in the process increase. And that's paramount in this moment of kind of complete distrust and kind of like dissolution of engagement as well that we're having.
Yeah, well, especially with there being so much volatility too, isn't there? And people, changing and some of the divisions and that we've been seeing, having credibility about decisions. Even if you don't necessarily agree with what the decision or the outcome was, if you have faith that it was made properly because there were enough people involved in it who reflect the experiences of people, it makes sense that can raise the tone. And I think that's we're always trying to think of what it means in the round for citizens, not just translating numbers. And this is such a great example of where we can begin to repair some of the damage that it feels has been done, not just here but around the world to the democratic fabric. So that's very, very, very important point, and great to have the other academics contributing to it as well. It feels like there's more and more people are coming on board, which is really encouraging. I'm going to go to some of the questions that are coming from people who are joining us now, Thea, if that's okay with you.
Yeah.
Great. So someone has asked about how this might affect smaller parties. Is there a sign that it's more difficult for a party that's smaller under a quota system? And then just while you're also having a think about that, there's another question about whether or not you think quotas should be used as a short-term fix to this problem, or if you envisage gender quotas being embedded in our electoral system in a permanent sense.
Yeah, I think I'll start with the second one first. I think at the ERS we see quotas as a backstop rather than a glass ceiling or a ceiling in place. And by that I mean that we see quotas as a way of stopping backsliding on any progress. So like I mentioned in Wales, like backsliding from 50-50 representation, we see quotas as a way of stopping that happen. And to that end, I think we would like to see them used until they become unnecessary. But on from that, used to ensure that they don't reverse the progress. And as gender quotas are a relatively novel idea to Westminster, not really anywhere else, it feels slightly preemptive to discuss removing a gender quota when we haven't actually seen the impact of the gender quota or what it would look like or how it could actually impact the makeup of Parliament, and also public perceptions of quotas. We're not sure about what the public think about them yet. So I think it really comes down to kind of like seeing what happens and guiding from there. And in terms of how this might affect smaller parties, you would only have to stand gender balanced lists or under a PR system in places that you were standing. So it wouldn't have too much effect on the smaller parties. I don't know what context the question was set in, whether it means right now or whether it would be under a PR system. Was there any more context on it, Darren?
No, I don't think so. I think it was just more about the effect of maybe in a slightly different setting. But sometimes if a smaller party does a campaign suddenly a whole lot better than they think they're going to do, maybe they've not perhaps fielded enough candidates because they didn't think they'd get do quite as well in the election, and sometimes that might be problematic for them. But I take your point as well. I think it would be if we moved into a PR world, then you would hope that it wouldn't be, and that it would only improve for a small party.
Yeah, and I mean, like independent candidates and smaller parties like that, like they wouldn't be under the same. Independent candidates obviously won't be under the same gender quotas that we're putting out at the moment. They would be exempt from those.
Just a question about what else do you think can be done to improve candidate diversity?
In terms of candidate diversity, I think that comes down to very specific party mechanisms to ensure that their candidates are diverse, and making sure that the support is there and the kind of holistic approach to supporting a candidate is there. At ERS, we are actively campaigning for the implementation of Section 106 of the Equality Act, which would compel parties to share candidate data. So that would improve the transparency of the selection of candidates. And so we don't really have, at present, we don't really have the data to help explain when it comes to standing why the playing field is not equal. So this Section 106 would give us the transparency of information, which is like the first step towards solving this inequality. So at the moment, it is slightly guesswork on the kind of like people that are coming through the parties and selection processes. In terms of what parties can do, they can provide stronger mentoring, funding, practical support for women candidates, advice on harassment online, all those types of things to improve candidate diversity.
Another question here about about how STV, the single transferable vote system, and gender quotas would work together.
In terms of STV, so you wouldn't have a list system obviously under STV, but you'd still be able to do gender quotas across like horizontal distribution, so across constituencies and across the UK, just like 50% women, 50% men elected in that respect. You wouldn't be able to do the vertical zipping of kind of like one by one that you would do on a list, but it's entirely possible. Ireland do it. They've been pretty successful in electing women under STV. There's more about how the actual the application, that's the word I'm looking for, in Ireland in the report.
Well, look, thank you very much, Thea, for talking about your report with us at this time, and right at the launch of a general election campaign as well. It's precise timing. And if people who have been watching and thinking about this topic want to head over to the Electoral Reform Society website, there's the chance to get the full report, which has a really rich data and analysis and issues that need to be considered there in the report to look through. And then there's also the opportunity to join the ERS, join our campaign, or to become a supporter of the campaign. You'll see all that information on our website. But it just falls to me, Thea, just to thank you very much for producing such a great piece of work and for answering so many questions. We've had a lot of questions over the hour, and I think it's just really quite an important piece, because it's linking together this topic that you've researched that is an existing serious issue that needs a response, and then looking at it through this lens on how we change our electoral system and try and get started with fixing the broken kind of politics that we see in the UK, and which we know there are great solutions for. So this is just another great piece for our work that will help us in our campaigns across the UK, and I look forward to hopefully receiving some more good feedback about it from tonight and from this conversation. And we can keep waving the flag on this topic, because it's a very important one, as you've shown us so brilliantly during our conversation. So thank you very much to you, Thea. And maybe, I don't know if you have any closing thoughts you'd like to share.
Just to say again that, like, it's amazing that so many people have turned up to hear a report like this, and I'm really thrilled to be able to share the research and to have such an informed discussion with all of you. Yeah, and any more questions, I'm very happy to talk about this topic until the cows come home. So